Welcome to Pigeon River Farm, doing farming right. I'm Robert Brown, the owner of Pigeon River Farm. Thank you for viewing. In tonight's episode, we're going to be showing a presentation that I had a chance to view and interact with at the Grassworks conference. It was Friday, the afternoon session. It was excellent. Great presentation. Margaret did an unbelievably good job, and what I got out of it, and I think if you are interested in goats, if you've been raising goats, you've been raising sheep, this is invaluable information. I've been doing it for a lot of years. I came away with a lot of great knowledge and a lot of real practical, common sense type of information that I think we'll all benefit from. So I think you should really enjoy this. Take the time. This one, probably sit down with a pen and notepad and take some notes. There's a lot of gems within the information she presents. So I thank you so much and enjoy the show.
So again, my name is Margaret Chamas. I am here with a couple of different hats on, hats, vests, name tags. I am currently predominantly, or first and foremost, the livestock viability manager for Practical Farmers of Iowa. So you can see me in the booth downstairs after this if you have additional questions. I also am a farmer on my own. I own Storm Dancer Farm near Kansas City, Missouri. And they're pasture-oriented, pasture-based, goats, lambs, occasionally beef cattle, poultry, and I did have 2 hogs this past year, and that's the last time. And then I am a Goats on the Go affiliate, so most of the reason I have those goats and the reason they make me money is because I do targeted grazing operations with them. I also have a smaller subset of hair sheep that I rotate with them as well for specific types of projects, specific types of forage. So because of that, I was asked to give this talk. And so there's all the various different ways you can get a hold of me. That contact info will be at the end. I'm always happy to talk goats, sheep, or animals in general with other folks. So who is here today? I'm curious, who here is someone who's raising cattle and might be thinking about sheep or goats, but currently you've only got cattle, right? We got a few of them. Who is here is a sheep rancher, farmer, grazer? Okay. And what about goats? Oh, look at you all, I love it. So again, there's some of you here who are thinking about it, some of you who are already committed. Who of you here think that if you were raising sheep and goats, you've got a little bit of a crazy streak? Okay, good, just as many hands, we can get along. So some of this, because I was pulling this together just the last couple of hours and days, some of this might be rudimentary to you, but we will roll with it. So an introduction to the idea of integrating small ruminants onto the landscape and into existing farms in particular. So cattle are your quintessential grazers. When we think about a grazing operation in the Midwest, especially upper Midwest, and even further west where I used to work in Kansas, people think cattle. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But sheep and goats are becoming increasingly popular, as I'm sure you all have noticed, and maybe you were part of that resurgence in the past couple of years. They have faster turnaround, faster generation intervals, faster growth and reproductive cycles, faster from birth of an animal to market, which makes them an excellent cash flow opportunity. I would also argue that there's more diverse possible income options with your small ruminants compared to cattle. And who here would consider themselves a small acreage farmer? Is that part of the reason you got sheep and goats? Yeah, they are exceedingly popular because that 10 acres that someone in my neighborhood might be able to barely afford as the city keeps sprawling further and further out, that 10 acres might let you support 1 or 2 cow-calf pairs, but you can get a heck of a lot of sheep and goats on it. But sheep and goats are not just small cattle. There's a number of nutritional, physiological, and just behavioral differences that make them a unique entity all their own. And so those are some of the things we're going to go over today. So we'll talk a little bit about the infrastructure needs and how they differ, nutrition and digestion differences, which I think is one of the big hang-ups a lot of cattle to small ruminant folks stumble over, some of the major health concerns, and then what I see as some of the market opportunities. So here I am going to focus mostly on meat, goat, and sheep production. I do have a hobby herd of dairy goats. For me, it is a hobby. They are registered show animals. But most of my management, most of my income producing work is with those meat goats, those meat sheep. And so some of the common breeds are listed up there. If this is new terminology to you, there's just some names to look out for. Small ruminant production cycles, like I said, they're faster than those of cattle. They are seasonal breeders, so a lot of times you can get your cattle to breed year-round. That is not going to be the case with the vast majority of sheep and goats. That's a management thing and a timing thing that you're going to have to keep in the back of your mind as you start adding small ruminants. They also tend to twin or triplet, or one of my dairy goat friends in Iowa had septuplets out of one of his dairy does the other day. So multiples in a birth is not uncommon. This is cool because it gives you more offspring per parent. On the other hand, it gives you more mouths to feed, manage, take care of, and potentially for things to go wrong with. But one of the coolest things is that you can start, again, you can go from birth to market in a single season. The cool part about goats, I know people who manage to go from birth early winter, or late winter, early spring. They market their animals at the end of the season. That's a lot less critters they gotta keep on their farm that next winter. That's a lot less hay they gotta buy. Cool opportunities if you can manage it right. So a simplified production cycle. They are seasonal breeders. They breed in the fall, kid in the spring. I will say kid usually because I'm more of a goat producer, but pretty much always if I say kid, I also mean lamb. We're breeding those does, usually August through December is when your breeding season is going to be. They've got a 5-month gestation, so now you're lambing or kidding January through April. To a great extent, everyone does that differently based on what sort of weather they want to lamb or kid into. My personal preference near Kansas City, Missouri is February, actually, because it's not likely to be wet yet. By March, I'm usually getting 50 to 60 to 70 degree days and rain. So I'd rather it be a little bit on the cold side. On the other hand, if it's colder and drier where you're at, December, January may be a terrible idea. You might want to wait till the grass is starting to green up in March or April. Think about your production cycle, think about your average weather years, and that will help guide your decision. And then of course you'll guess wrong, and then the next year you'll have a fluke, and then they'll all freeze in the middle of April. But this is overall, hopefully this will help out. Usually I leave my critters, my babies, with their dams about 3 months. By the time they hit that 3-month mark, those little boys are going to be active and ready to breed those little girls, or potentially their mamas. So that 3-month mark is when I tell people you need to be looking at weaning and separating those little babies. So my other presentation I had kind of on deck was my Goats 101, which I thought was a bit more basic than this crowd would want, but you'd be amazed at the number of people who have gotten their pet backyard goats over the last few years, get their little boy and their little girl, and then a year and a half later, they're like, well, I didn't think he would breed his mama or his daughter. Yes, they will. So separation at that roughly 3-month mark is pretty important. And then at that point, you've got some options. So there is a market weight for cattle, right? There's roughly an idea. You want that steer to get to finish. That weight might vary a little bit with your particular breed, somewhat with your market. There's less of a set end point in the sheep and goat market. A lot of it's going to depend on who you're selling to or what you want to sell. So you can market these animals as weanlings, you can graze them out, get them a bit bigger, you can put them into a feed yard situation and get them even bigger than that. But the general idea of a market lamb is somewhere between 60 and 90 pounds. And that's partially based on, that's the weight they're going to be at that 6-ish month mark before they're considered mutton in terms of the growth plate closure. There is actually a definition between sheep and mutton if you are not aware. For goats, the market is a lot more variable. There's a high ethnic market and a high ethnic demand for goats at different weights, ranges, sizes, genders, castrated or uncastrated status, and you are just going to have to figure that out for your area. I've got some resources, but I get people asking me for 30-pound goats, 15-pound goats, and 120-pound goats. So it's hard to target any one of those markets, or it's hard to have something that will make everyone happy. Infrastructure. A little bit of a biological note. So if you're familiar with beef cattle, they have what's called a thermoneutral zone, somewhere between 32 and 70 degrees. That thermoneutral zone is the range of temperatures at which they spend no extra energy to either warm themselves up or cool themselves down. So saying the lower end is 32 degrees, cattle can survive well below that, as I'm sure you're all aware. They're still outside right now, but they have to expend energy to keep themselves warm. Above roughly 70, they're expending energy to cool themselves off. It's causing a stress on the system. If you look at the thermoneutral zones of sheep and goats, you'll notice that they get colder quicker. They spend energy to warm themselves up at a higher temperature than cattle, and they can handle more heat than cattle. So when you're considering whether they're right for your operation, consider those thermoneutral zones and think about that in terms of infrastructure. So I have, again, Kansas City, Missouri, so significantly further south than here. I have hair sheep, I have goats. They get hot and miserable in the summer, but they do okay. I also had Highland cattle for a while. They did not do okay. They shrugged off the worst day any winter could give them, but they could not handle the summers. So I had to adjust my management, I had to adjust my infrastructure to deal with the different needs of these species. So a rule of thumb for small ruminants, especially when it gets cold during the winters in the upper Midwest, they are going to need some sort of shelter. Thickets can be enough of a shelter, simple sheds can be enough of a shelter. Where I'm at, I worry about flooring as well because we have wet springs. I get a lot of mud, and so my barn floor is concrete, even though it cost me an arm and a leg, because I want to be able to keep them up out of the mud, especially those little babies. It's not uncommon for me to get 2 or 3 or 5 inches of rain and then have it freeze a couple of days later. And so that's just a death sentence for any animal who's out and about without a really good shelter. Goats are going to require more substantial shelter than sheep, which are going to require more substantial shelter than cattle. The exception is if you're raising bull sheep, which might be a better idea for upper Midwest, but again, by me, I don't want to have the time and expense to shear them, and they get so heat stressed during the summer, the wool is just not worth the extra hassles for me. Bull sheep can handle almost anything. I put them on par with cattle. But hair sheep and goats have to be able to get out of the wind and rain. That combination, wind and rain, is pretty deadly for them. Fencing. Who's had goats escape their fence before? Yes, yes, yes. Small ruminants are generally going to be harder to fence in than cattle. I hear a number of people who've managed to get their sheep flocks onto single-strand hot wire. That's awesome. I've heard a couple people claim they can mostly get their goats to stay in roughly okay, kind of, with 1 tensile or 1 strand hot wire. Good for you. I'm sure you still have escapes, you might just not know it. But if you're like me and you've got neighbors with cornfields, you need to have those animals in a spot and not leave that spot. So electric is very common, either multiple strands of hot wires or electric netting. Premier One electric net is kind of the bread and butter of my grazing business. And one thing to think about, even if your animals are kind of staying where they're at, these are much more prey species than your cattle. So you're also trying to keep those predators out as much as keep your animals in. That electric is probably the easiest single way to do that, to do both things at once. Considerations though when you're building this fence. Sheep and goats have horns. Most goats, almost every goat, and a good number of sheep have horns. If you've got woven wire existing already, they're going to put their heads through that woven wire and get stuck. Be ready to pull a lot of heads out or put extra hot wires so they can't do that. They are escape artists. They're going to find the gaps in, over, under, through your fence. With bull sheep, that wool can also be an insulator. It can be a bit of a shock protection, so training them up front is exceptionally critical so that they learn not to challenge it from the get-go. And another big difference between sheep and cattle that's relevant to fencing. Sheep and goats don't like water. They won't cross, generally my rule of thumb is they won't cross a stream that's more than ankle deep and unbroken for about 5 or 6 feet. If they can't kind of tiptoe across rocks, they're probably not going to cross it. So consider that when you're managing your pastures, when you're setting up laneways, alleyways. And you can also use that pond or stream or creek as a 4th side of a fenced-in pasture until it hits winter, and then they will cross the frozen water, and then I didn't realize that until they were almost into the neighbor's farm. But when the water is wet, they will stay on one side. Handling also becomes a challenge. If you've got to work those animals, you need to be able to catch them and keep them in a pen, throw them in an alleyway. Your regular old green pipe gates from Tractor Supply or Orscheln's are not going to cut it. Those gaps are too big. They'll either get their heads stuck and have a conniption fit, or they will slip out and run. So you can buy sheep and goat specific panels. Those work pretty well. It's more costly. You can buy, you can use T-posts and cattle panels. Those tend to work a little bit better. I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do it, but before you're thinking about adding these animals, before you're thinking about trying to retrofit or add them to an existing pasture or farm, think about some of these differences. There are sheep and goat specific chutes and tilt tables. They're pretty cool. They lift the animals up a lot of times so that you don't have to keep bending over to trim hooves or give shots. But if you have to watch out if you've got a chute that's this tall that lets you lean into it and deal with the animals. If it's only that tall, the animal might pop out. So I've seen some people build taller chutes, but then have a walkway on the outside, so they're standing a foot off the ground. They can still lean in pretty easily, but now that wall is 4 feet tall and the sheep and goats can't jump out. So infrastructure takeaway. You can't simply throw 2 dozen hair sheep out with your cows and expect them to do fine. You'll need to make sure they have adequate shelter for their individual needs. You'll need to think about the fence that you have, and think about whether you're willing to convert to an entirely new set of fence, whether you're going to manage this group of sheep slightly differently or separate from your cows and work from there. Another little one I wasn't sure where else to put. If you're watering out of stock tanks, and you've got those nice big 100-gallon stock tanks that are about this tall, your sheep and goats aren't going to be able to reach in there. You may have to retrofit some of your watering systems as well. Nutrition, and this is a big one. We are all familiar with the basic concept of a ruminant animal and the rumination process. All right, so the goats or sheep or cows eat that feed. It goes into the stomach, it gets ruminated around. The bacteria in the rumen are the ones breaking that down into nutritional or individual nutrient components that the animal then absorbs. So the animals aren't absorbing the protein from the feed, they're absorbing the protein from the rumen bugs that ate the feed. This is really cool. This is the advantage, this is the beauty and magic of ruminants. They are not what they eat. They can take advantage of a huge variety of feedstuffs, and the goat's or sheep's or cow's body doesn't know the difference to an extent because the rumen bugs have made it into consistent little building blocks that the sheep or goat or cow's body can then use. This also means they can neutralize some toxins, they can make something out of nothing, so to speak. It's also a disadvantage that they are not what they eat. You can't say, gosh, this animal needs more energy, I'm going to add fat to the diet. It doesn't work like that, because the rumen bugs are going to take that fat and turn it into whatever they want, and the goat gets, or goat, cow, sheep gets whatever their byproducts are. And there are some cases where it's harder to supplement or fill the gaps in their nutrient needs because you can't do it directly. So has anyone ever given a sick sheep or goat B vitamins to help boost their metabolism, get them back on track? How do you give them those vitamins?
IM injection.
You give them an injection. Why don't you feed them?
Because it gets broken down.
If you feed them the vitamins, it'll get broken down by the rumen bugs. Interestingly, anyone's heard of vitamin B12 as a particularly important ruminant nutrient? See a couple nods. Vitamin B12 is called cyanocobalamin. It has a cobalt molecule in it. If you don't have enough cobalt, the rumen bugs don't make enough B12 for the animal. You can inject the animal with vitamin B12 to supplement its needs, or you can feed the rumen bugs more cobalt. But you cannot feed them the B12 and inject the cobalt. It does not work both ways. Sorry, my master's was focusing on ruminant nutrition, and so this is my area of geek out. I also went to a rumen microbiology conference once. If you ever want to see people nerd out on the absolute weirdest stuff ever, go talk to the scientists who study the bacteria in a rumen. It's fabulous. Sheep and goats have higher nutrient needs than cattle. The rumen functions the same way, but there are species differences. To an extent, this is just a factor of size. A smaller animal is going to need more energy density per pound because they can't fit as much poundage in their stomach. More significantly, this is a factor of their evolution. These animals have evolved into different ecological niches to eat different things. We know cattle are grazers. They're mostly eating grass. They'll eat a little bit of forbs. They'll occasionally nibble on brush. Our sheep are kind of in the middle. They'll eat some brush if they can reach it easily enough. They'll eat quite a bit of grass. They'll also go after some forbs. Our goats are predominantly browsers, but they will graze and eat forbs, but they love that browse. So this becomes a mindset shift, especially with the goats. People say, oh, we have goats, they eat the junk. To us, it's junk. To the goats, they've evolved to eat the things other animals won't eat. Those other things actually have high nutrient density. It's just harder to get them. That's why goats have those little prehensile lips. They can pull the individual leaves off of something with thorns. They strip the bark off things. They've evolved to eat things that other animals won't, and it turns out have a much higher energy density. If you're familiar with plant structures and the breakdown of plant fibers, we've got the yellowy cellulose. That is the most digestible part of plant fibers and plant cell walls. The hemicellulose on the outside is a little bit less digestible, and these red stripes are lignin. That's the stuff that makes plants stiff and tall and stand up straight. It's pretty much indigestible to anything. Goats mostly digest the cellulose. Sheep and cattle can digest more of this. And so when you feed a goat plain old hay, especially older dry hay, they are not able to break down as much of that fiber into useful nutrients. So you do need to keep in mind they have a higher nutrient requirement if they're not getting kind of their natural dietary patterns. So this is the best kind of Venn diagram I've seen of the 3 different species and the different types of things they eat. Cool study I found when I was looking up info for this. So some scientists, they must have gotten some poor grad student to do this work. They looked at the activity of animals as they were as a percentage of daylight hours. What did these sheep, goats, and cattle do? They were in a very diverse pasture that had browse, had forbs, and had grass. Our cattle pretty much grazed. That's about all they did in terms of their eating activities. Sheep grazed and did a little bit of browse. Goats did a little bit of graze, but spent most of their time browsing. Again, these don't add up to 21 or up to 100% because you also have to add in the time of rumination and idling. But this just shows the behavioral differences when left in a pasture with everything they could have wanted. This is what these animals will naturally be inclined to do. So then what these researchers did is they said, okay, we're seeing what activities these animals are doing. Now we're going to go take samples of the same types of leaves and plants that we're watching these animals eat. And we're going to see the dietary composition or the nutrient composition of those samples. So let's look at the crude protein. Goats were selecting for things with a higher crude protein than the cattle or the sheep. Lignin, again, that indigestible component of the plants. Goats were selecting for stuff with less lignin. Their bodies can't digest it. They're going to try and find the better stuff. Meanwhile, cattle have a much stronger ability to digest lignin or digest closer or more mature or more lignified plants, so they didn't really care. And this is digestibility. This is the more digestible or the higher this number, consider it kind of like a TDN. This is just how much you put a sample into rumen juice and see how much of it is digested away. Goats and sheep had much higher digestibility in the diets they selected compared to the cattle. But the cattle, they were all adequately fed. The animals just have different needs and different selectivities. So let's look at some comparative nutrition between sheep and goats. This is not me prescribing a diet. This is just a way to keep in mind what your animals are going to need at different times in their life cycle. So your sheep are going to have a minimum of a 10% crude protein diet. I've seen some stats as low as 7%, but not from the more reputable sources. These are NRC tables. So a minimum of 10% up to 14% for high demands of lactation, and north of 60% TDN for any animal that's expecting to grow or perform rather than just be at maintenance. Goats are even higher, minimum 10% protein up to 14 and 16%, and on the upper end of the 60s for TDN. Let's look at some of our common forages. So your average pasture, and of course, what the heck does that mean? We don't know what this pasture is. But your average pasture is going to be adequate for sheep and goats when it's vegetative. Once it becomes mature, you can meet the needs of your maintenance animals, but you might be shorting your growing animals, your pregnant animals, your lactating animals. Alfalfa hay, certainly adequate, but your more season hays are going to be a little bit on the low side. I'm in the fescue belt, and so I've got fescue everywhere. I know that it's not quite enough for my critters. Now, let's look at the nutrient composition of weeds and brush. So on the left is mostly brush, on the right are weeds and a few types of brush. Pretty much all of these are meeting or exceeding the needs of those goats and those sheep. Again, they will balance their diets out, they will select for what they need, they just have to have it available. Don't think of these things as junk, think of these things as part of the diet for these sheep and goats. At the same time, don't assume that you can just put your sheep and goats in with cattle on an excellent cattle pasture and think that they're going to be able to meet their needs year-round. This might mean you have to supplement those animals in the off-season in particular. Protein and energy might be lacking. So you can do things better hay, the protein lick tubs, that's what I do. When I had a small number of goats, about 30 or so, I bring out a bag of, just a bag of feed every day or so, and I kept them in perfect condition all winter long, had great healthy kids. I've really enjoyed using spent grains from my local brewery. It's just a pain in the rear to get, and soy hulls are an excellent way to get protein without a lot of, you don't have an acidosis risk. It's protein and it's good digestible fiber, but no starch. The potential challenge here becomes if you have a single flurd, how do you feed the sheep and goats what they need without overfeeding your cattle? So again, as you consider adding these to an enterprise, especially if you already have cattle, try and think about how you might be willing to handle those things. Minerals are slightly different in your sheep and goats. Going over this really quickly. Copper is a big one you will hear in all the goat and sheep circles. In the goat world, we almost can't get enough copper. Copper boluses, high copper mineral. It's important for their hair coat. That's the easiest way to see a deficiency. It's also important for helping them fight off parasites. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, parasites are the bane of existence of all small ruminants. At the same time though, high copper levels are toxic for sheep, especially wool sheep. So again, if you're looking at doing a mixed herd, how are you going to manage those two different conflicting entities? Some people put out a low copper mineral and then just copper bolus their goats. Some of us say, I can't be bothered to do that, and they put out the same red brick they use for cattle, and then occasionally supplement other stuff as needed, but just say, hopefully the sheep all make it. I will say that hair sheep don't seem to have the same susceptibility as wool sheep do, so because I have not had issues with that so far. In the grazing cattle world, we talk about grass tetany a lot in the spring because of low magnesium. That's not generally an issue with goats. You don't need to, or sheep or goats. Has anyone had a grass tetany issue in a grazing small ruminant? Yeah, I've only ever heard of that in cattle. At the same time, we hear a lot more people talking about selenium deficiencies in sheep and goats compared to cattle. Having a bottle of Bosie on hand is not uncommon for sheep and goat folks. You get that kid who's just acting a bit stiff, a bit funny, and we dose them as they're born. I grew up in an area that's notoriously selenium deficient, so we were supplementing all those does throughout the winter as well. So take away from this section, sheep and goats have higher base nutritional needs. They need more protein, they need more energy. What this means on a practical level is you may have to supplement at least during the winter, which may affect your target management or how you house and keep these animals. Some health stuff. The predominant thing I'm going to talk about here are parasites. Of our sheep and goat people, who's lost an animal to parasitism? It's not uncommon, and this is a focus, finally, of more and more research and effort. If nothing else, remember this website if you don't have it bookmarked already. wormx.info is the site that the American Consortium of Small Ruminant Practitioners puts all their research and all their data into. It will have the most up-to-date, research-backed recommendations on deworming protocols and also, more importantly, other management practices to reduce the likelihood of getting parasites. Challenges that goats and sheep in particular have. Let's start off with goats. Goats are natural browsers. They eat up. The parasites are usually in the lowest 4 to 6 inches of grass. Goats naturally should not be ingesting many parasites. They have not developed the immune systems to fight them. as an evolutionary whole. There's more and more selection being done now for goats to have that inherent resistance. You can get lines who are quite resistant. There's forage-based buck tests, things like that. But as an evolutionary whole, as a species whole, they are much more susceptible than cattle and sheep. Sheep are still more susceptible than cattle, but it's not quite as drastic in goats. Now the problem is goats have not been an economically important species for long enough to warrant enough research about the use of dewormers, and because it just wasn't as important that they were more susceptible, dewormers have been so chronically overused that most of them are relatively useless, especially on their own. So we're now looking to management, selection of animals, things like that to help control this problem. Another interesting and really frustrating challenge, you've probably got deer, I've got lots of deer. Those deer can be vectors for a lot of these parasites as well. There's no way to fence the deer out effectively, or at least affordably, and so you're always going to have some influx of stuff into your pastures. So the best practice is to rely on rotating your animals adequately, selecting the best animals, keeping them healthy and vibrant and strong enough that they're able to fight off any new loads of parasites that they get. The 20-80 rule tends to apply. About 20% of your herd is going to be housing and shedding 80% of your parasites. Rather than keep treating that animal again and again and again, you might as well just cull it. Get it off your farm, stop it from shedding, and just keep the genetics that are not struggling as much. Management-wise, you can do rotational grazing. That helps with pretty much everything ever, and it helps with parasite management. The trick is you need long rest periods to let those parasites kind of grow, hatch out of their little eggs, climb up on the grass, and then shrivel and die when they don't find another host. It might mean that your rest period is longer than ideal for proper forage management, so you're going to have to start making compromises somewhere. Again, I'm not qualified to tell you what that compromise should be, just something to keep in mind. Mixed species grazing helps, and while sheep and goats and cattle are similar, cattle are different enough from our small ruminants that they're generally dead-end hosts. So maybe you're doing a leader-follower system. You let those sheep and goats go through, eat the tastiest, best parts of that forage so they meet their higher nutritional needs. Then you're following up with cattle to eat a little bit further down, the slightly more lignified, more mature forage, and maybe they'll slurp up some of those parasite eggs that have hatched, and it just doesn't bug the cows at all. Avoid grazing too low. As with everything, that's part of the reason for not grazing below 4 to 6 inches is A, to let the forage recover better, and B, so that we reduce the likelihood of ingesting those parasites. Cull the chronic ill-doers like we already discussed. And I've got the herbal and natural preventatives with a question mark. So copper supplementation has been shown to help those animals fight off parasitism. Goats specifically, do not copper bolus your sheep. Just don't. You'll hear people talk about tannins. The tannic acids in certain types of forages are also shown to have a consistently inhibitory effect on parasite loads shed out in the feces. So tannins are found in things like oak leaves, some conifers, and lespedizas. Is anyone here, I wonder if this is part of this, Sericea lespediza, is that a name that rings bells for anybody? Okay. Again, I'm from Missouri. Is it considered an invasive around here?
Depends on the species.
Okay, so like Sericea?
Sericia's bad.
So I'm in a couple of nationwide goat groups through the dairy goat side of things, and I hear people going, have you heard about this lespediza stuff? It's great. I'm going to plant Sericea lespediza in my pastures. And I'm like, no, it might be invasive. It's invading out my pastures. I don't mind it because I have sheep and goats, but there's a lot of people I do targeted grazing for who don't want it because it will choke out a lot of other species. It's in my pasture, I don't mind. It's not getting out of control because I have sheep and goats eating it a lot, but it can be very invasive. So before you get hooked onto any one of these individual supplements or interceding something new, make sure you're not going to regret it in a few years. Even with all this best management though, sheep and goats especially can be jerks, and you're going to end up with some that just get sick, that fall behind, that something else happens, they got stressed, and now the worms are taking over. So what do we do then? Our goal is not going to be to eliminate all the parasites. We do not want a clean body system on these animals. If we clean out every worm that's still susceptible to the drugs that we have on hand, then the only ones left are the ones with resistance. They're going to breed, and they're going to breed more that have resistance. So we actually want to leave enough of a susceptible population that the susceptibility gene is always present in the worm gene pool. That way, when a goat has 2 times more worms, let's say, than it can handle, we can cut that by 2/3. The animal can still survive, but we still have that susceptibility gene, rather than cutting it by 90% and losing that susceptibility gene in that in that worm gene pool. So our goal is to make the overall level of parasites within our herd low enough it's not causing us economic or health damage, but high enough that we have genetic diversity and can always, kill off a bunch of them with medications. Has anyone done a 5-point check or familiar with the 5-point check? Okay, we've got a couple, but I will go through this one. It's a simple and quick way to evaluate your animals and tell if you have, or if it seems that you have a parasite issue. The only way to really know what species of parasites you have would be to take fecal samples on all of your individual animals, send them to a lab, or do it by yourself and do a fecal exam. You have to hope that the parasites are hatching at the right time or shedding eggs at the right time for you to actually catch them, and taking a pooled sample of your entire herd is not terribly useful because it's not going to allow you to identify the individual animals shedding. It's also not practical in the field to wait days when you mail a sample out to your vet, who then mails it to a lab, who then gets the results and gives it back to you. So the 5-point check is a way that we as producers out in the field dealing with these animals can actually make informed decisions, take care of our animals while also trying to manage those parasite populations responsibly. So number 1 is our eyes, the FAMACHA score. This is a test of anemia. The most economically damaging parasite is the Haemonchus contortus or barbacoal worm, and it causes anemia. So you look at under the inner eyelid, the mucosa in the inner eyelid, see how perfused with blood it is, basically how pink or how pale, and that gives you an indication of, what's the anemia level that this animal is dealing with. The paler the underside of the eye, the more likely you are to have to deworm that animal. I would say that I can never remember which number is high or low. So a high number is bad in this case. If I've got an animal with white or almost white under eyelid, I'm going to deworm it and start it on some supplemental iron and other things because chances are it's a parasite issue. Usually you want a couple of these 5-point check things to indicate, we probably need to treat. This one alone is one where I'll say, we probably need to deworm. Bottle jaw is another one. As these parasites are sucking the nutrients out of, taking these nutrients from our animals, they'll actually get like a protein deficiency, which leads to edema, and it collects under the chin. Bottle jaw is another one. I'm highly likely to deworm an animal if it has bottle jaw because that protein deficiency causing that edema is almost certainly a parasite issue. We'll also body condition score them. There's 2 different ways to do it. On the right is the sternal one, so that'd be like feeling around their brisket. Think about when you're looking at a finished beef cow, they've got that big basketball jiggly brisket. That's less practical on sheep and goats, I think, so I use the back method. I'm walking out, checking my goats every day. I walk around the pasture with them, and I'll just try and grab a few hips and see how concave or convex the transverse process is. So this is looking at about right behind the ribs of the goat to the hip bone, the back and spine along there. Visually, this doe here has a body condition score of about 1. Yes, that's my goat. Yes, she looks awful. She's an ancient retired doe, and her happiness is babysitting our orphans. She's happy, she's healthy, she's not in pain, and so I just can't get weight on her. She's an old retired dairy doe. This is a dairy doe who kidded about 2 or 3 weeks before this picture was taken. She's just spent a crap ton of energy growing these kids and now making milk for the first time. She's milking straight off her back, but she's gaining weight back. And so she's a 2. I want her to be a bit higher than this, but I wasn't worried about her. This doe is a couple more weeks or months into lactation. She's picked up a bit more flesh along her back there. And this is Violet the Chub Chub, who jumps out of the fence, goes eats whatever she wants, and so stays morbidly obese most of the time. Numbers 4 and 5 on that parasite management, or that 5-point scale, are the tail or DAG score. I don't know where DAG came from. That's just looking at the tail. If you see that monkey butt, if you see smeared, dried up, crusted old diarrhea. A lot of times diarrhea has to do with, it can be parasite related. If all I see, if the only thing that seems wrong with that animal is a mucky butt, I'm gonna start thinking about other things. Did I switch feed? Did I put them into a new pasture? Did the weather change? Could something else have happened that's given them an upset tummy? If that's the only sign of trouble I see, I usually give them 24 hours. If they're still scoury after that, then I start thinking about parasites more. And the hair coat. You want that, in goats at least, you want that nice slick hair coat during the summer. You want that nice cashmere undercoat in the winter. Hair sheep, it's hard to call them slick or shiny or sleek or anything, but you've probably seen an animal with ragged, patchy, uneven coat. If you goat people, you know what a fishtail looks like. If you look at the tuft on the end of their tail, let's see, we might be able to see it. All right, so you see, when we shave dairy goats for show, we leave a little pom-pom on the end of their tail. Don't ask me why, but if you ever see a bald tail, it looks stupid. A fishtail, which is a sign of copper deficiency, they'll have like a little, it looks like a little mermaid tail. They'll have a little divot, and you can usually see the bald tip of their tail, and then tufts of hair above and below it. If you see that fishtail, that's a sign of copper deficiency. You'll also see a black animal starting to fade and look rusty. Signs of an inadequate hair coat means that something is leaching nutrients, fat-soluble vitamins, and minerals from that animal. Probably a good idea to bump up its mineral count and or consider parasites as a possible issue. So if you have if you see multiple problems, if you're going down this 5-point list and you're checking off multiple boxes, yeah, I'm seeing some of that problem. Yeah, I see a bad hair coat. Yeah, you know, the eyelids are a little bit pale. The more things you check off, the more you think about clinically treating for parasites, so pulling out those medications. So if you do get caught with a worm issue, if you've decided I need to treat this animal, it's got a serious worm load, it's harming the health of this animal. Current best practices are only deworm the animals you need to. Do not deworm on a schedule. It's amazing the number of people who are first-time goat owners and come to me and they said, well, my vet said to worm every 30 days with ivermectin. Your vet is wasting your money, I'm sorry. Only deworm if you need to and who you need to. There are 3 main classes of dewormers. Use 2 of them at once. My recommendation, okay, not my recommendation. The recommendation of veterinarians who study this at the moment is to use one of the azoles and one of the mectins. So that's going to be your valbazen or your fenbendazole, your safeguard, and then ivermectin, Eprenex, Cydectin. Personally, my favorites are Cydectin and valbazen. Valbazen is not safe for pregnant animals, so I always have safeguard hanging around. This 3rd class here, which doesn't have like handy, similar sounding names, Morantil tartary is actually the only one of these medications approved for use in goats. It's also basically useless. So if you can't find anything else and you need that second type of dewormer, go ahead and use it, but I wouldn't buy a bag of it and have it on standby just in case. Strongid is largely, from what I've understood, it's largely not terribly useful in goats. This one though, levamisole, prohibit, Levamed, I think there's a special name for the pig version they sell. This is our silver bullet. This is all we have left. If you have that valuable animal who's down because of parasite issues, you give that plus the 2 of the other classes. Please don't use that unless you have no other choice and it's a valuable animal, because that is the last silver bullet we have. So we're trying to protect that as much as possible. Another reason to keep you from going prohibit crazy, if you overdose it, it tends to kill the animals. So if you are going to use that one, drag out your scale, use a weight tape, try and dose appropriately. But if you can, try and avoid using it at all. Other miscellaneous health and management things to consider before you're adding goats. They might need hoof trims now and again. I'm trying to breed and manage so I don't have to do hoof trims more than once a year. At this point, I don't trim everybody every year, but now and again when they're on the trailer, I'll see someone's got long toes and I'll whack them off a little bit. Hoof rot and hoof scald. Hoof rot's an issue in cattle. I feel like it's more of an issue in sheep and goats. You get a nice wet season. Goats don't like being wet, but if they're forced to be in the wet for too long, you might get that one lameness, that smelly crud between their toes. So learn how to treat for that. treatment is give them a nice hoof trim, a bit of oxytetracycline between their toes. Sometimes an injection helps. Hoof and heel, copper tox, usually is fairly simple to clear up. Banding and castration. So the timing depends on a lot of different things. There's a lot of debate on the timing. I mentioned that kind of critical 3-month mark, which is my don't do it later than that. Also because wrangling a goat much bigger than 3 months old gets really painful and annoying. Other debates that come into this, if you are marketing your livestock, marketing your sheep and goats through a feedlot type situation, 15-minute warning. If you're marketing your goats to someone who's going to feed them out, they may be concerned about urinary calculi, and there's a lot of discussion of early castration being linked to a higher incidence of urinary calculi. Anyone here have a clue what I'm talking about? Okay, hopefully this is not an issue for most of us if we're working on a forage-based system, but basically what happens is if you're feeding your sheep and goats a lot of grain, and their mineral, the calcium to phosphorus ratio gets off, it can cause the buildup of urinary stones. For does, this doesn't matter, they can urinate them out pretty easily. For bucks and rams, this is a problem because the urinary system is so kind of twisty, windy, and narrow that they tend to get stuck. There's a lot of people saying that delay castration as long as possible because development and width of that urinary tract is testosterone dependent. If you band too early, they don't get enough testosterone, it doesn't widen enough. The research does not back that up, and I'll tell you, I've lost as many bucks to urinary calculi as I have wethers. Luckily, it's not too many, but it's happened both ways. So the more important thing is either keep a forage balanced diet, or have a supplemental feed or a properly balanced feed so that they don't get urinary calculi. But you will encounter people who say, don't ban them day 1, don't ban them at 3 months, don't ban until a year old. Have you ever tried keeping a yearling buck out of the doe pen? I'm sorry. Tail docking, this will be for sheep specifically. I'm not going to get into the debate over ethics, but this is just another practice to think about. And if you're going to get sheep and this is something you're going to do, think about how this is going to fit in your management plan. Identification. So it's always nice to have tags on your cattle so you know who's who. There's actually a legal requirement to have a scrapie ID on your sheep and goats. These are tags that have a number that's associated with your farm. USDA stamp, it's going to have a special logo on it. If you're just moving your goats between your farm and other pastures on your farm, it generally doesn't matter. If you're selling one big group of animals at the auction, they can have a single, basically identifying number. But if you're showing these goats, if you're transporting them, if you're selling them to other breeders, for instance, they will each need to have a unique scrapie ID, so they'll have to have that farm number and a unique number for that animal. You will have to keep track of where you sold that animal to. That person then has to keep track of it, basically. So if there is another outbreak of a disease, particularly scrapie, which is almost eliminated but not quite, they want to be able to track the movement of those animals, to track it back down and get rid of it at its source. Health takeaways. Sheep and goats require some maintenance, some hands-on maintenance that may differ from cattle. That fast growth and fast reproductive maturity means that they'll start breeding early. I've gotten myself in trouble by not getting out there and weaning soon enough. So as you're planning out your grazing systems, your plans for the year, make sure that part of that is building in that time to do these different management activities. And make sure you're ready to manage for parasites just as much as you're managing for forage. It is such a killer in the small ruminant world that managing for those parasites is almost more critical than managing for optimal forage quality. Now, a little bit into trying to integrate these different enterprises. So you think you want to add sheep or goats either to your farm period or to your cattle operation. Are you going to run them together? Do you want one big flurge that you only have to worry about that one group of animals to deal with? That's great, but how's that going to change your fencing requirements? Are you willing to deal with, what if we have to sort the sheep off for shearing day or banding day? How are we going to do that if the cattle are in the same group? Things like that. Will you need to change or add infrastructure like buildings or water systems or water tanks? How are you going to time kidding versus calving and lambing? Do you want them to all be going at the same time? Do you want to stagger them? There's no right or wrong answer. But as someone who's doing most of my farming solo, I gotta spread out my busy seasons. Otherwise, things are gonna fall through the cracks. And how are you gonna handle the different nutritional needs, especially during the winter? So consider your resources. These are not hard and fast rules, this is just my kind of first impressions. If you don't have a barn and you don't want a barn and you want your animals to be able to overwinter outside, you're probably looking at sheep instead of goats, unless you have a lot of really thick timber. If you have lots of timber or brush, definitely consider those goats. They're gonna be the ones who do the best job managing and cutting that timber down and grazing and making use of that resource. If you don't want to shear, avoid bull sheep. They do have to be shorn at least once a year. That is kind of an ethical health and well-being necessity. And if you only want to have one third, I would probably say sheep. I think they overlap better with cattle. They certainly overlap on the same sorts of landscapes. So again, if you don't have a lot of timber or brush, you don't have that niche that goats really fill, sheep are generally simpler. Sheep are going to be easier to train to 1 or 2 hot wires. They're probably just going to fit in a little bit easier, and their nutritional needs are not so far off of cattle. Sheep and goats offer a lot of different income opportunities though. Obviously, we're focusing on the meat and marketing side. Again, that faster generation interval. You can buy bred ewes this fall or even right now and be selling their offspring at the end of next year. They have a quicker turnaround, a quicker cash flow. There are higher market prices per pound compared to cattle. That's pretty much universally true. It's been increasingly true the last couple of years. And there's flexibility. That goes cattle, you want to get them to that target weight, and your market might demand that you get to that target weight by a certain date so that you can get whatever premium you're looking at. With goats, there's enough different markets and enough different demand for different types of animals that you have a little bit more flexibility in terms of what you're raising for and who you're selling to. And I cannot let this go without talking about some of the wonky alternative marketing methods. So I thought I put fiber in this slide. Fiber is an option if you are a wool sheep producer. In PFI, we're getting a lot of interest in fiber, so we're looking at doing more programming around it. There's a little bit of a resurging interest in wool. Agritourism. Let me tell you what, I have a date on March 11th. I'm bringing maybe 8 or 10 of my bottle baby dairy goats to a park and maybe a rabbit and some chickens. And I'm gonna hang out there for a few hours and let the kids pet them, and they're paying me $800. Okay, this is a serious moneymaker. You have to be willing to deal with people. You have to be willing to answer dumb questions. I hate goat yoga, but I get paid quite well for it, so I'll do it. Don't dismiss these things, though check with your insurance and make sure they cover it. Targeted grazing, that's where I make actually the bulk of my income has been from targeted brush grazing with the goats and prairie management, prairie restoration, other services with my combined sheep and goats. Solar grazing is looking like an increasing thing. As more and more solar installations go up, discussion about whether, I'm not saying farmland is the ideal place to put solar panels, but if it's going in, we might as well get some use out of it, get those sheep underneath it, and continue to get an agricultural value off of that. It's also an opportunity to expand your grazing base, and generally, you're getting paid for it. Not hugely handsomely, but gosh, if I could get paid pasture rent to rent someone's pasture, I'm probably going to take that up. And I'm going to be willing to deal with a few of their rules about, okay, the sheep can't be around this part of it because we have to get in there to maintain it. Marketing goats. Auctions are the quick and easy way to just get rid of animals and get a price for them. And again, auction prices are decent at the moment. There's a good enough demand that you can usually get a respectable price. My experience has been that January through June are peak prices in my area. That may not apply across the country, but that's been my experience. Watch those market reports to figure out when your target marketing season might be. Can also do direct marketing. I have done whole and half goats and lambs for people. I've also found that, at least at my local processor, it's pretty easy to call them up and say, hey, I've got 2 lambs to get butchered. They can usually fit me in within a week or two versus 18 months for cattle. So there's a bit more flexibility there. What's nice about that is I don't have to have my lambs pre-sold ahead of time. Someone can call me up, say they're interested in the lamb, and I can say, sure, I've got a big one I'll sell right now. call it up, get it delivered within a few weeks, and boom, that's cash in my pocket, and someone found me. I didn't have to do the work ahead of time to get all these lambs reserved. There is a high ethnic market demand. Sheep and goats, for whatever reason, are not highly consumed in the US, but in other nationalities and ethnicities, it's a major part of their diet. So if you can connect with some of these people, that's potentially an endless and very profitable market. These folks are generally looking for sale of live animals. So you are not taking this to a processor to have it USDA certified, cut up and wrapped. They have another way of preparing it. They often want to do the butchering and processing on their own. This leads you to a couple of discussions and decisions you'll have to make. Do you let them slaughter on farm? I know in some states it is or isn't allowed. Yep. I know it's not allowed in every state, every circumstance, so do your research there, and then also just decide what you're okay with. Know your market. I had one family that wanted the biggest possible wethers I could get them. If it was 120 pounds, they were happy. That's what they wanted. I've had, there was an older Italian gentleman who wanted a only milk-fed 15-pound kid. That's what he wanted for Easter. So you're gonna have to just learn who wants what, who's near you. I had a family that I've sold bucks to the last few years. They want the biggest, smelliest, stinkiest buck they possibly can. So you have options, but you're gonna need to make sure the right people are near you and are willing to take the animals and willing to take them before they've escaped your pens and bred all your does. Ask me how I know. I will say, this is a really awkward, ugly link, but if you look up Cornell Goat Program holiday calendar, this is an outdated PDF, but Dr. Tatiana Stanton collected the most well-known holidays that have like specific, for this holiday, these people want this size of goat or lamb, castrated or not, male or female. She's got it all listed out, the description of the target animal size and the community that might be looking for it. You would have to double check what the dates of those holidays are for now, but that's a good starting place if you're looking at this option. Last little bit I'll do, because I'm sure people want to see some numbers. This is napkin math. This is not me telling you you're going to make this much money, but this is napkin math. Who's heard the rule of thumb that you can add 1 sheep per cow and not affect the cow's ability to find forage? I've heard you can add 1 sheep, 2 sheep, 3 sheep. Basically, because they have different dietary preferences, you can add a couple of sheep per cow without taking away any forage from your cow. Let's assume that that's the case. Let's assume we can add 1 sheep per cow. What does that look like for us? Sheep aren't usually as prolific as goats, so let's say this ewe produces 1.5 lambs per year. Those lambs finish the grazing season somewhere around 60 pounds when you're looking at marking them. I found $2.50 per pound live weight. I looked at my local market report. I looked at some market reports a little bit further away, and this is kind of just a very, very rough estimate, napkin math. At 60 pounds, at $2.50 a pound live weight, that gross profit per ewe is about $225. Considering you didn't take any forage away from your cattle, that sounds pretty good. Now you've got to feed her through the winter and all that stuff, but there's something to think about. What about a goat? So let's say you've got a third of your farm in timber, and so you're going to fence that off separately and run some goats through it. I got a bit fancy with this math, because how do you tell how much timber a goat can eat? Using some data from my own grazing operation and some of my friends, I'm coming to a number of roughly 200 goat days per acre. That's when we put these goats in and make them eat pretty much everything. So let's say if we're doing this more rotationally, more regeneratively, let's say we can rotate them twice through the timber every year at a lesser rate, 125 goat days per acre per grazing, so 250 goat days per acre for an entire grazing season. My grazing season is about 180 days, might be a bit less here. Here you might also be willing to let them go through the winter and strip some bark. So that lets you get about 1.4 goats per acre. What does that 1.4 goats get you? Well, mature goats are more likely to prolifically produce 2, 3+ offspring. So let's say she has twins every year. Those kids don't grow as big or as fast as those lambs, so each of those kids finish at 50 pounds. That's 100 pounds produced per doe. They sell a bit higher. $4 a pound live weight in January is not unheard of. That's $400 gross profit per doe. I'm not telling you you're going to make $400 per doe on this acreage you have. These are just some very basic numbers to start with. Think about how this might fit in. Also have to consider this doe is going to need more supplemental feed over the winter. It's going to reduce your net profit a little bit, but just some things to start thinking about. So the bottom line is sheep and goats can be an excellent addition or an excellent first grazing animal for your farm. They require less space and less sheer square footage, though they might require more specialty forage or specialty shelters. They can fit into those unoccupied niches on the farm. They're sure as heck easier to get a hold of, and you know, I can manhandle a goat. When my bull didn't want to go onto my trailer and instead went through my barn wall, he won. My goats don't get to win. So it's a little bit of a different game. And it's a faster turnaround and a higher dollar per pound net. But think about it first. Are you set up for all the differences they have? Are you set up for their particular feed, fencing, water needs? Does the timing of kidding and castration and weaning and hoof trimming and breeding, does that fit into your system or where you want your system to be? And do you even like them? If you don't like them, you're just going to be mad at them and just want to eat them and not want to manage them or raise them. So make sure this is something you want to do first. Don't be hooked on the idea of $4 a pound live weight. With that, I will take questions. If you want more goat education, I'm probably going to do a Goats 101 class by Zoom and a hands-on session. I also know that there's a Goat Expo and management course down in Missouri, which is a stretch for all of you, but that's just where I'm based out of, so that's what I know most about. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the information you've seen here. I know I did. It's a couple times around for me, and I still got more information out of it. So I thank you so much for viewing, and have a most wonderful evening.